Hello, this is Noah Lee, and this is my submission for this is EGR302 for sprints 3 and 4 individual progress update. First of all, going over my breakdown of labor for these two sprints. First of all, from sprint 3, I completed about 6 objects here, those being starting testing of data flow and data flow integration between the database and the application, navigating from the main page to profile, checking the database requirements, creating the profile screen itself, and creating a kind of smaller project but supporting an alternate testing screen just to be able to view some of the other parts of the application. You can see here, subscription of everything for data flow and integration. This was just testing the connection between the application and our database. This has been completed. Between the two different things here, they're both completed. I decided to merge them into one item here, both for space and since they're very closely related. For the main page and creating for navigation to the main page as well as the profile page itself. These are both fairly simple, just creating a rudimentary profile page to view user information when logged in and creating the functionality to navigate into the profile page from the main page of the app itself. These have both been completed and were both also very simple. For database requirements, this is something that I've worked with my team to determine what we expected the database to look like. This is completed for the most part. However, there are still some loose things that are going to need to be refined and changed around a little bit as the database evolves, and we figure out what more data we need specifically for the application. Lastly, was supporting an alternate testing screen. This has been demonstrated, I believe, a handful of times as our temporary navigation screen. This is just created for the purpose of being able to look between a couple of different screens for the purpose of easily navigating between different menus or different pages as they're needed during development. Moving on to sprint 4 now, there was a lot more work done in this sprint. As you can see, we have the 5 items here: loading data into Firebase, organizing scheduled data, migrating from a real-time database to Firestore, creating the multi-screen item for Classroom, as well as creating a JSON loader for parsing the data that Ethan created and moving that into Firestore. Going over these again, top down for loading data into Firebase. This was fairly simple. All I did was hard code some temporary data that would be used in the application itself. These were testing values just to get a semblance of what we could be working with before we had a good outline on the data itself. As you can see on status, these are marked as complete old. This is because while technically, yes, they were finished in this sprint, they were completed very near the beginning of the sprint. I think it's actually the day after the sprint ended. So I'm marking them as old because I kind of consider them to be part of the previous sprint. For organizing scheduled data, this is also a fairly simple thing to do. Also part of the primary load of data into Firebase, just cleaning that up, making it look a bit nicer and adding some more to it based on what we expect it to need to do with the data itself. I'll go ahead and jump over the migration for now and discuss the multi-screen classroom since migration and JSON are part of the same thing basically. For the multi-screen classrooms, this was me creating an object within the application itself, a custom classroom object that would store information about the classroom itself in such a way that we can use it later in the app to view the information, manipulate it, and store it afterwards after retrieving it from Firebase. Then for the migration from the real-time database to Firestore, I again briefly composed some test data and loaded it directly into Firestore manually. After this, I was able to use the JSON loader to actually parse out the data from Ethan and load this into the database in a way that was coherent and in a way that had all the information that we need. Both of these items took up some of the largest amount of time for the sprint that I've logged. This is because these things both required a large amount of time investment to retarget from the real-time database to Firestore, as well as parsing out and composing the JSON data in a dynamic way that works with a JSON file of any length. Moving on from here, I'll go ahead and briefly show off the features within the application itself, just to show what everything looks like for now. I'll go ahead and get logged in, courtesy of Mohammed's login method. Briefly, I'll go ahead and pull in my IDE itself just to show off something about loading the data from Firebase. As I can show here, if you focus on the debug console, when I log into the application, after a couple of generic calls to the login features, we start getting this classroom load information. This is something that I have currently just printing to the console, and as you can see, it takes quite a while to load. This is because with the implementation that we have, it's a very slow process for loading everything. And since we load only the page once everything is completed, we do not have a streaming buffer for any of this data. I am looking into, for the upcoming Sprint 5, changing this from a snapshot requiring the entirety of Firebase to be pulled to instead using a streaming buffer, which should load everything dynamically as we pull the data from Firebase. Excuse me, from Firestore. And there we go. After loading everything, the app has successfully display all of our information, with these all showing off the individual classrooms based on the building, just sorted alphabetically for now. I'll go ahead and move back to the presentation screen just for the simplicity of the display there. As I can display here, if I go ahead and click on the profile option here, we bring up the profile screen. This has been greatly improved by Mohammed. My initial implementation was a very simple, very hard-coded set of data, just for the purpose of having a structure that could be used later in the application. But as you can see here, we have this very beautiful profile page. Again, thank you, Mohammed, for doing all of this with the very simple navigation between those pages here. And then, of course, though not directly visible, all of these classrooms here are being displayed dynamically with the classroom object that I created. These all being much nicer to see in the application itself, since we load them all with that very long list of debug statements from the console. Okay, moving on from there, I'll go ahead and start showing off my code in GitHub. So there's quite a lot to go on here. I'll go ahead and try and show it all off. This might be a bit longer of a section. Starting off the best I can from the back of what was changed for these sprints. This was a fairly simple commit just to integrate a function that Mohammed created for that snack bar on the bottom of the screen. Whenever some buttons were clicked, I believe this is now actually been removed after changing a lot of the features around. Some of these are actually going to be rather old features that have been removed or changed since the initial commit of them to the branches. But this is very simple, just showing context on the bottom of the screen based on the buttons on the initial login screen. From there, this was an addition for the temporary navigation page, that debug page I was talking about, to navigate into Mohammed's login page, just to be able to view that one from our debug page, again, for the purpose of being able to look through what is available in our branches, in our pages before they were finished. So to the last one, this is just adding support for the room detail screen on TempNav. I think a lot of the length here is going to be on account of the fact that I have kind of a bad habit of maybe committing too much. I like to be very detailed in everything that I add, which ends up adding a lot of, I think, a bloat to my commits. If possible, I may get some feedback on if this is a good idea. Should I try and make commits be more concise instead of pushing like every little thing that's changed? I don't know. From there, we added a very simple pop button for the navigator from the login page back to the navigation page. This is, I think, almost certainly deprecated by now. Here's another case of me, I think, probably doing a bit too much here, just removing like 3 lines from different pieces from 3 files and making a commit out of it. Meh. Same thing here. I think that I push things in smaller chunks, which leads to these things being in separate sections, when all it changed was just importing some packages. Here is supporting Firebase testing to the nav page, and then providing a very small template here for how people can implement their own if we need more on debug. And then this is the first integration of the classroom object. At this point, this has absolutely been reworked. We're doing a little bit of a different thing. I believe the implementation now is that it is still a map, but now I believe this is either string or map string list string, with no more enum being supported, since we're not using days of the week anymore. Then this is the first implementation of interactions with the database. This is using Firebase, very similarly to the I believe it was the meals application, started using Firebase to start interacting with a backend, pulling data, loading all of that, and then just very simply pulling some simple data in. Firebase testing is kind of a mix of making some actually useful functions along with being able to interact with everything as I'm working with it. Again, this is just me slowly working with building up Firebase testing. This is working with the Gate Classrooms object, parsing some tags out to be a more formatted method, parsing out some data, and then returning a Classrooms object, manipulating all of that, and then having that be viewable in code. Or in the application, just logging into console for the interactivity of Dart. But again, changing a little bit of the way that we handle this data. And I just updated the enum to be a little cleaner, changed the map to now it is properly a day of week and string. Again, this will be changed to map string in one of the later pushes, creating the constructor, and then creating a simple toString function on it as well. Once more, an example of a commit where there probably maybe didn't need to be one, just changing from targeting the nav page to instead targeting the login page directly. This page has been removed, but we did have an admit data screen that we were supporting. This was with the intention that I believe we would have admins be able to go in and update that data. This was just supporting printing to console from the Firebase testing branch, being able to pull the data in and then just display it. Again, this has been removed and changed around. And yeah, so again, this is just very simple, just literally removing literally 2 words from code. Ta-da! This was an implementation to support pulling of room codes from Firebase. We have a section within Firebase that has room codes mapping, for example, James being short as JAME or engineering being TEGR for room codes. This is just a feature, this is just a function to pull all the building codes from Firebase and then compose a map and return that based on the information. Actually, excuse me, here in this case, we're actually just editing a map. I believe this is still in a very much testing phase. I added a comment, that's all it is. And again, just removing some stuff that we didn't end up using here. Changing this from some initializers that we didn't need, moving classrooms into the function, getting rid of the tags, and then removing the old list string of tags. Changing around some of the data here, I believe we actually end up using a different method on tags here. Instead of a list string, it just is a string itself. And then these are inline instead of having to have some false. Then this is a more complete feature for pulling data from Firebase. Again, still using Firebase instead of Firestore. This is me starting to work on some functions that other people can use to pull data from Firebase. Once more, just removing some simple data that I didn't end up needing and making it be a commit because why not? And here, there's no actual data being changed here. Besides, I believe I pushed the format button. And then besides that, we change around some data here, create the building codes object, initialize the temp building codes, that up, and then primarily what happened here is adding some buttons and some nested buttons just to be able to print data into the console for the purpose of debugging and testing. Same thing, this is just a simple function to pull the building codes for use later in the project, or in other places by other people, that is. And here for playlists on the testing screen itself, I just moved all of the individual buttons into an expansion tile. I believe there actually are multiple expansion tiles here, each for these individual types of buttons that they are. So this one is for basic Firebase stuff. We have one for getting classroom things. So we have one for getting a good image and a bad image. We have one for classroom tags, again, same thing, bad and good tags, just showing the results of valid and invalid data. Here I add the navigability to move into the Firebase testing screen from the primary navigation page, or pardon me, from the debug navigation page, and then commenting all of the buttons themselves. Once more, very simple test here just to smooth out the process of changing from targeting the login page to navigation page during testing. Just setting up a Boolean value and inline Boolean to either use the temp nav or the primary login page. Same thing here, I just made sure that we were using the actual login page for everyone else instead of my testing page. And now, finally, with pleasure, we move into from Firebase to using Firestore. This consisted of an almost complete refactor of much of what the code ended up being, entirely deleting most of the integrations for Firebase, changing everything that was used here to instead use Firestore with calls to Google Cloud. A lot of this consisted of adding some documentation, changing the way a lot of these function, due to, if I may, being rather efficient with the way that I set these up. A lot of the functions here still work with a refactored list of classrooms, thanks to the classroom object being created on its own through with its own object and then just being populated by either pull, moving from Firebase and the real-time database to Firestore was, while a bit painful, not as difficult as it was, since we just worked with the classroom object on its own, so long as it was populated correctly. The primary things that were changed here were most of the actual calls that return either a future or some data that directly needs to interact with Firebase as one would expect. So here is where the bulk of what most things were changed is. Instead of referring to an HTTP on the Firebase URL, we instead directly call Firestore, a Firebase Firestore as an instance and pulling all of that data as a docref. So just pulling everything from here, pulling all these values out, creating a temporary map for this data. This was changed. This still does show the enum, but this was changed shortly to use the actual just to use string data for the dates. And then still just going through here and parsing out all of the data from Firestore, composing it into useful objects, creating a classroom object, adding that to the list of temp classrooms, returning the classroom object, changing the master tags to instead target the actual document where they are stored, and then simply returning that data very cleanly. The building codes function was also changed, again, just using the Firebase Firestore implementation, using the document where buildings are stored. And then a very simple initial function that I used while messing with Firestore, getting familiar with it, and figuring out how the data was formatted. Then, of course, just simple updates to the data here to target Firestore instead of Firebase. And here is the implementation of a multi-stream classroom object, importing packages here. Then on the main screen itself, this is a domain object that is passed with the implementation, with the, I believe, future implementation, as in not future as in waiting for it to return, but future as in still waiting on this being completed. Intention to try and show that this application can be modular if multiple sets of data were to be composed on Firebase. We can use domain to filter by different pages. So here we are creating the late final list classrooms for the classroom object, then pulling the information here, creating the future void of load classrooms to populate the classrooms object. And then this is still, I believe, just printing all of the information of classrooms. In this commit, there is no implementation to display all that information yet. And then just passing this domain object in. This is temporary for the navigation page. Then here's where within the login, we pass through the email. This is again going to be used to show the implementation of being able to, but not doing it yet, being able to target a different university's set of classrooms instead of the one that is hard-coded with just CBU. Here is the beginnings of me working with the Firebase loader, using a very small sample set of data, working with parsing this out, and providing results from there. And then this is nothing interesting whatsoever. This is just whatever NPM and JS pulled in for supporting JSON and JS stuff. This was like literally 3,000 files changed. What's that? 438,000 lines updated. This is nothing that I did. This is just, I mean, I did this. This was what I had to implement, but this is just from JavaScript loading all this. But like, oof. And this was an implementation within the main page. We have a stack bar on the right side of the screen that rolls in when you tap a button. This was implementation was implementing a navigation to that page for presentations or being able to view within the app from login. And so this was a very small implementation just for changing the way that we use some data. I initially had a hard-coded size, but I ended up being able to use the full object and then just changing how we handle data. And here, as you can see, here is the change to the classroom object, moving from the enumerator to just using a string, with the format being something along the lines of this. So instead of using an enumerator targeting one of these, we instead just use a string where this is our first object and this is our second object. Updating the Firebase Polar object to, instead of targeting the enumerator, we instead just go ahead and populate the data with the day and times. Very simple change here, but it can clean up a lot of code. And then with a final implementation that I am very pleased with, we have the final appearance of the final implementation of the loader to send data to Firestore. We have our class object. This is a constructor that I implemented into JavaScript for functionality. This list of images we have from Pixum, which is the equivalent of like a lorem ipsum for photos, just for some placeholder data for the classroom objects. These are randomly accessed when creating classrooms off of the data. Same thing for tags. This is just created here for testing and it's not actually used. Pulling simple test data from Firebase just to see how that would look. Then we have pulling multiple classes, testing with batching through Firestore's implementation. Just testing out how batching looks for this kind of data. And finally, the feature that I am very excited to show is the put classrooms, which uses a complete list of classrooms from reading local data from a file to parse this into a complete function. Schedule to JSON, simple thing was added here, just for parsing out the scheduled data into a JSON object. Reading the local file, handling how that is displayed. Instead of using hard-coded data, we instead just target the local file. And then I'll go ahead and show this by pulling up the file on my computer since loading it did not work. So this is the file that Ethan was able to compose from Ad Astra, just showing all of the information that we were able to pull from this. I am incredibly grateful for to Ethan for having created this. This was pretty much the make or break part of our application. It was incredibly nice to have this to work with. He also provided me with a very simple, a sample of some of these data just for being able to work with them for testing purposes. Go ahead and try and skim through here some more interesting data. So here is, for example, some of the data that we worked with, this being an object for the classroom with all of its scheduled data and then the array of its scheduled times. Just wanted to show that off briefly to show you what I am working with here. And that's been everything. That's all of the commits. I'll briefly go ahead and show off Firestore just because I am rather proud of it. I apologize for blinding you there with the white screen. So here is the final implementation of Firestore rather than the real-time database. Mohammed is working with users. I don't touch much of this. The California Baptist University collection here is the primary one. This is, again, with the implementation that in the future we might be able to have multiple universities. So for instance, we could have like University of Riverside, University of California here, and then have the same kind of information embedded in here. We have the buildings collection. All this is just storing the information on all the individual buildings. So as you can see, we have the EW pairs of the short building code and then its long full name. This is for showing off more information if we need to later in the project. Moving into the classrooms document, we have a field for the tags that all classrooms can have. This will probably be expanded, but that's why it's in an object like this, so we can expand on it later and then just refer to them dynamically within the code. We have our classrooms collection. This is going to be a bit difficult to explain, but I'll go ahead and give it a try. I'll go ahead and put on to music so we can have some more information to work with. So here is, for example, an object or a classroom. This is room 147 in the School of Music. We have our fields for the very generic image. I can go ahead and show that off real quick. It's just a very simple placeholder image for a generic classroom. Just to have something a bit more interesting to look at. We have an empty tags field. This is still pending implementation. Moving on from here, we have the schedule collection with the schedule document. Impressive, I know. Then the fields themselves, which then again, this is storing the information for each date and then each schedule, with the implementation that we will eventually be showing all this data dynamically and being updated daily for the application. Looking back into my presentation, I believe that actually is everything. Oh, I missed the team name. Oh, darn. Oh, well. Well, this is empty room. I work with empty room, I swear. Okay. Thank you very much. Hope I went over everything. Sorry, this is a little bit long. I didn't want to try and cover everything. There's just a lot to cover here. Okay. Thank you very much, and goodbye.